about this country mass incarcerating at a higher rate than any other country in the world, and the implications of what you brought out are really important. Our last presenter is Kevin Gosztola, who you can follow at the Dissenter blog at firedogblake.com, and we also stream it live at worldcan'twait.net. Kevin.
Yeah, so I want everybody to have some opportunity to get in here with questions, so I won't let my presentation drone on too long. But I guess I'll begin by saying it's very refreshing to me that I don't have to start off by debunking the fear-mongering that has come from anonymous government officials who like to talk into the ears of the establishment journalists in the media, because it definitely does seem like what they have said for the longest time has dominated in the news media, but most of you already believe that they're lying. So I don't have to get into everything that they've said about the system, but what I do think is important to emphasize is why it is important that we have all of this documentation, and why it is so important that we don't just say to ourselves, oh, well, if you talked to me a year or 2 years ago, I would have suspected that all of this was happening. I knew just based off the Bush administration, and I could kind of tell from President Obama that he probably hadn't ended it. I knew that these sort of things were happening, but as a journalist, I don't get to just I'm not supposed to. I know some of my colleagues do, but we're supposed to not speculate. We're supposed to deal in fact and actually have something to back up the statements that we're making. So in order to talk about dragnet surveillance, it's helpful to have documents that show that you have these servers located all around the world that are intercepting people's data, and that they are in fact being targeted and without suspicion, and that people are everyone without probable cause for the target. So that's important, and I think that we should look at how the attention to the NSA has been vastly amplified in the last year, and I actually went through and put together a statistic through a database that's very popular among journalists here in the country. It's called LexisNexis. And I went and I looked, and I was curious to see what the difference would be. So between June 2nd, 2012 through June 1st, 2013, news wires. If you looked at newspapers, web-based publications, magazines, journals, news or news transcripts. Those are the different categories. And you combine them all together and you look at how many times NSA, just that NSA was mentioned between June 2nd, 2012 and June 1st, 2013. There were 675 mentions in this database. Now, if you look at the time from June 2nd, 2013 to today, that number with all those same categories is 6,955 mentions. So we have 1,000% increase in the amount of attention to this agency that, for the most part, people in the country weren't looking into. If you looked at journalists, there wasn't a lot of interest in covering what the agency was up to. And I think it's probably for a combination of reasons. I mean, we all have become very aware. Well, I think actually if you just take it on a personal level for citizens here in the country, NSA has this overwhelming issue that they're dealing with, where people are sending in FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests for their own data, saying, I want to know what kind of information you have on me. And of course, they reject that. But that's the case. NSA has historically believed that they are not an agency that has to respond to the Freedom of Information Act, that they are exempt from this law. And so in order to get any sort of records, you have to file some kind of a lawsuit. You have, and it helps to do some high-profile litigation. And so you have very few news organizations that are engaging in that sort of activity prior to Edward Snowden coming forward. And you have the reality that you're just, there's not a whole lot of interest in getting into this. I mean, even when you have a court case moving up to the Supreme Court challenging warrantless surveillance, most of the news media not taking these people seriously, even though they have names like Naomi Klein of The Nation, and people in law firms who have represented high-profile terrorism suspects, and people who are representing others in human rights organizations, even though they are, I think, influential people who deserve some attention. There's just a lot of ignorance and not caring about what they were doing. So I think it's important to think about that. And then I suppose one of the things to shifted. I believe that there has been this shift. And I watched it when I viewed the, I think many of you probably watched it, when Edward Snowden did his exclusive interview with NBC News this past week. And while there was something really, really absurd to me about NBC News sort of like running into the room and shouting about all this stuff they just found out, which most of us had already heard if we were paying attention to The Guardian. I also recognized that this was a huge deal because there are hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of Americans who have never gotten to hear Edward Snowden speak at all before. And so now they were able to hear him articulate and defend himself. And I also thought, what kind of media were they probably reading and digesting and viewing in the last year? And it was probably that meathead Mike Rogers getting on Meet the Press, and it was probably Michael Hayden being on, and Dianne Feinstein, and all these people who just get called in on these Sunday morning news programs to talk about their view of what's going on, and Peter King, this like vile man, Peter King, being asked to come in and talk about his views, and so they had never heard anybody, they had never heard from Ed Snowden, and understandably for a year, he didn't want to be the story. But I think a year later, this was a good, appropriate time to come forward and explain to the American people, what he was doing on this broadcast. He had done the waiting game and had gotten NBC News to a point where they would basically let him say whatever he wanted to say, and that was a pretty good strategy. And so he was able to speak his mind, and I think one of the things that was fascinating to me was not really even the interview, actually. It was the post show, which I watched on the internet, and I don't think a lot of people saw it, but it was actually kind of fascinating to me because these establishment journalists, I could tell in their minds they were contemplating these national security state issues that they had never even thought about before. Like for the first time in this hour program that they had set up here, they were thinking about these really critical issues of like the Fourth Amendment, and they were thinking of these things that Edward Snowden had said, and even the people who were, I guess, the pro-government people. They had this former ambassador, Michael McFall, and they had Michael Leiter, who used to be the head of the National Counterterrorism Center, and they both talking and spouting the pro-government view that we would expect. But what they were doing was they were debunking what Edward Snowden had said. So it wasn't them that got to frame the debate. It was now Edward Snowden who framed the discussion here in this post show. And that was a first, I think, to actually talk about things as if, the burden is on you to prove that Edward Snowden is wrong. And I've seen that, and I think that's why we had this sort of chauvinistic, jingoistic comments that we got from from Secretary of State John Kerry, because I think they're very frustrated. Everything that Edward Snowden is doing is really having an impact and influencing and changing everything. So there's a whole list that I made of things that have come out in the past year with everything that has been released. I think one thing that I'll highlight is just a couple examples of people who have been harmed. I saw this liberal journalist who writes for The Guardian saying something during the exclusive interview. Can anyone prove that NSA surveillance has harmed anyone up to this point? As if to discourage people from being interested in this interview. And I said yes, actually we can prove that. And you mentioned this. It was the story that was published in the Huffington Post about how they were targeting the porn viewing habits of radical Muslims with the intention, like the clear intention of actually getting these people to shut up and stop talking within their communities. And they recognized that they were not terrorists, but because of their extremist views and how influential they were becoming in their communities, the NSA and the wider U.S. government was apparently concerned that these were people they needed to eliminate and neutralize. But they weren't going to drone them, I guess. They were going to try to embarrass them with their porn viewing habits. And the other thing, this hasn't gotten a lot of attention either, but there were some internal NSA documents that Glenn Greenwald wrote about for The Guardian that showed how the NSA had pegged opponents of drone strikes as threats or adversaries, and had complained that people who were showing that they were upset about these groups that have legal opposition that promote these sort of arguments that drone strikes are outside the boundaries of international law, that this is in fact a part of a propaganda campaign on the part of terrorists, and actually said, and this is a quote that one of the propaganda themes to look out for is that, quote, attacks against American and European persons who have become violent extremists are often criticized by propagandists, arguing that lethal action against these individuals deprives them of due process. So this is supposed to be propaganda. You are not given due process. They also, I think, they're sort of like projecting too in this document, because they mentioned that they don't like that we use the word drone because it undermines their ability to just randomly target and assassinate and kill people. But they themselves freak out if you use the word drone, and like anytime that they're invited to a conference and the word drone is involved in the headline or the title of your panel, they'll always give this long, really long-winded disclaimer about how they're not going to use the word drone in their presentation. And what other word they're going to use? They have like a bunch of different acronyms that they want to use. They haven't even settled on the one acronym that they want to use to propagandize us with. They just keep coming up with different combinations of things to use. So, in the past year, some major things that we've seen happen are that we have more declassification of materials, because having these programs out in the open for us to read about and having our public officials have to acknowledge them in the process of doing their little shell game reform efforts in Congress. They themselves have given in and let groups like the Electronic Frontier Foundation actually get documents in response. And those documents that Obama administration likes to claim credit for having released are actually the product of a judge granting a court order, issuing a court order and saying that you have to release these documents, and then the government chose not to fight that, but they chose to not fight that because then they could come out and claim to all of us that they're suddenly being transparent, and we should congratulate them. And so now we have many more materials that we can look at from them about how they were defending doing this sort of activity. And then we can also see some of the secret surveillance court opinions. And then also importantly, I want to raise that in this past year, because of all of these disclosures, you now have a situation where people who are charged with crimes, particularly terrorism, can try to push for access to FISA materials, to the surveillance records that were collected, and in fact, there's a case in Chicago that I'll be covering. I'm going to one of the earlier pretrial hearings on Wednesday, and it is a case. His name is Adel Daoud, and he is basically your typical sort of terrorist pumped out of the FBI's factory of manufactured terrorism, as we have come to see that they have hundreds upon hundreds of these people who basically, this individual was 18, and he was on a jihadi web forum, and you're just talking to people, and then the FBI informant decides that, or one of these agents decides this is the person we're going to manipulate and try to get them involved in committing some type of a terrorist attack on a local Chicago bar. And so now for the first time, the lawyer has actually been successful, and the government is very alarmed that there's a situation where it could be incredibly precedent-setting, and the defense has actually achieved the judge saying you should have access to this material. They've given them access to all of these secret surveillance records that the government, for the longest time in the last decades, has been able to prevent any defense attorney from getting their hands on. And so now the government is completely panicked, and that hearing is going to be them just expressing all of this outrage about why they shouldn't, why the defense shouldn't get these records, but the ACLU has and EFF has filed a brief in this because they see the importance of breaking this history. So the final point I want to make here is just that Gore Vidal used to say that we're the United States of amnesia, and I see a lot of things happening now, and then when I read stuff that was written back in the 1970s, it's incredible how identical it is to between 1970s and today. It's actually, it seems like they just copied and pasted certain official records and just like came and brought them back out. And so I noticed that while this isn't the NSA, in the Church Committee's report, one of the things that they put down in this book 3 is that the legal theories advanced to justify use of warrantless wiretapping were entirely developed almost entirely by executive branch, by the executive branch itself, legitimized by the reluctance of Congress and the Supreme Court to confront these officials directly. That's exactly what happened in the last 10 years here. And I guess some people could argue that that's what was happening in the 1990s, and that's what was happening in the 1980s, and we just, by luck, we had some people in these agencies that backed off and weren't doing it as zealously. And so the other thing is that in this book that I picked up, called Lawless State, The Crimes of the U.S. Intelligence Agencies, which was put out and was looking at all of these different agencies back in the 1970s. One of the things that they put in the book about the NSA is that they're making this claim that anything they accidentally collect on Americans is okay because they weren't targeting these people. And so anything that's incidental is great. We can just have it in our database and keep it because it just happens to be useful. And that's the claim that they make today, that they can do anything accidentally or incidentally if they just happen to keep it. And that's what I think stood out. One of the things that stood out from the Edward Snowden interview was that he was saying that something he doesn't like is the dirtiness of the way the agency operates and how there is this lack of care about being specific and targeting people and not sweeping up the data of every single person. So those are the points that I wanted to make, and thank you